Okay, we're going to take a look at some basic programming of the super knob. Now, I mentioned that the super knob controls automatically 8 assignable knobs. And this is on the upper level, what we call the upper level of editing. So let's hit the edit button. The edit button is the third one down from the performance home. And unlike the DX7, we expect this edit button to be hit often. All right, so let's hit edit. Now, what I'm looking at here, there are 2 columns of parameters. I'm looking at control and controller number. So this will tell you on a per performance basis, you can decide what the controllers are doing. Now, I'm going to point out here that foot controller 2 is defaulting to the super knob. That's how it's assigned there. All right, foot controller 1 is an expression pedal. You have breath control, you have the ribbon controller, you have your assignable switches, and each of the 8 assignable knobs can be set to send a control. But this is where the control numbers are, and this is per performance. So you can customize each of your performances to how you like to work. Controller assign. Now, this is a very important part. On this upper level, as I mentioned, the super knob automatically is going to change the values of these 8 knobs. But it doesn't do anything unless you decide a parameter that you want to control. So we're going to take a look at what you can control on this upper level. When I say the upper level, remember, you can control 8 sounds under what we call keyboard control. So on the upper level, you need one level to rule them all. It's the one ring that rules the rest of them. So this is the upper level. On the upper level, you have options to control specific parameters. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm on the control assign screen. And in the upper line, the top line, you see it says edit common/audio. Now, the reason audio is up there is because audio is a very big part of the motion control engine. For the first time, the A to D inputs, analog to digital inputs, can modify sounds in the motion control engine. So it is overall, you can assign it from that common level down to the different individual parts. So common/audio, you're on the top level of editing. So on the common audio level screen, I can go to control assign and look at an overlay comes in from the left of all the possible destinations. On this particular one, it's on the variation effect and it's doing LFO speed. But I'm going to use the data dial here to give you an idea of all the possible destinations. There are over 251 parameter destinations within the Montage. All right, so this is not your regular CC message. I just want to stress that. All right, CC messages, you know, you have CC10 for pan, you have we have 251 destinations. It's a little bit bigger than your regular control change messages. So any effects, you can see there are 24 destinations within insert effect A. And what this is referring to is at the upper level, that's the audio inputs insert effect. In the Montage, each of the 16 parts can have 2 insertion effects. Plus, the A to D input, the audio input, can have its own dedicated 2 insert effects. And all of those can be controlled. You can control what happens to them with the super knob. I can control reverb. Now, reverb is what we call a system effect. That means everybody in the system has a send to that effect. So it's much like having a console where you have an auxiliary send on each channel. So I can send a little bit of the vocals. I can send a little bit of the part 1, a part 2, a part 3, and so forth. So you have the reverb. So all of its parameters would be available, all right, for assignment. The variation effect. The variation effect can be several different things. It can be a delay, a chorus, a flanger, and so forth. It also has a send control from each of the parts. So once again, what I can do here, you can see that variation LFO speed was the one that I set it to, but you have all of these different parameters. Now, some of them don't have a particular setting right now because it depends on which effect you've chosen. The master effect is under control of the super knob as well. All right, A to D parameters. I can change the volume of the incoming signal with the super knob. So maybe your acoustic guitar player is a modulation source for what you're doing on the keyboard. Or maybe your drummer is triggering something that you're playing on the keyboard. You can control the volume of that A to D input. You can control the reverb send to that. You can control the variation send. So everything, you can think of it as automation for almost anything you want to do. Now notice here that parts 1, you can assign part 1, assign 1. Part 1, assign 2, right through 8. That's talking about part 1's 8 assignable knobs, and we'll see that in a minute. And then, of course, you can go to part 2 and part 3 and part 4 and part 5 and part 6 and part 7. You get an idea of how massive this control matrix is. So you can control anything, all right, from the upper level. Okay, so I'm going to take you back and we're going to go to the variation effect, LFO speed. All right, and you can see I have a second destination. Now a destination, we're talking about controllers, sources and destinations. So a source is some kind of physical control. Could be a knob, a wheel, a pedal, could be a breath controller. So it's a source, it's a physical control. The destination is the parameter that you're actually controlling. And what we've done now is give you, an infinitely more programmable depth parameter. In other words, I can change things positively, negatively. I can use a standard linear curve. I can do all kinds of things with this. And as we go along, we'll get a little more advanced. We'll keep it simple at first. When you see a plus in the screen, that means touching that box would allow you to add a new controller. All right, so on our previous model, the Motif, and on the MoXF, you could have 6 source destination control sets. In the Montage, you have 16 control sources and destinations per part. And at the upper level, you have an additional 16. So there are going to be 4 boxes on a page and then 4 pages of possible items that you can add. All right, so it's 16 destinations. You use your imagination. We'll start with just 2 so that we can hear and recognize what's going on. So we're going to change the LFO speed and the variation pitch modulation depth. Now let's translate some of that jargon into like musicians' English. What are we talking about? What is a low frequency oscillator? Well, a low frequency oscillator is something that is vibrating. In any musical instrument, there's going to be vibrations. All right. So when you think about any instrument, if you think about somebody playing a trumpet, what is the oscillator in a human being playing a trumpet? I should play the Jeopardy theme here, but I'll give you a minute to think about it. What is vibrating when a human plays the trumpet? Well, if you're thinking correctly, you know it's the lips. That's all a trumpet player is doing if he takes the horn away. The lips are vibrating. It's what's called a lip reed instrument. So the oscillator is what's oscillating, all right? In a saxophone, what's vibrating in a saxophone? All right, so it's the reed. The reed beats back and forth as you blow air between it and the mouthpiece. What about a flute? Tougher, right? You're blowing across an open hole that causes a vibration. There's always something oscillating. Now, the easiest is piano. If you play piano, you know it's the string that has to be hammered and it goes into oscillation. So the human being can hear between 20 cycles per second and 20,000 cycles per second. You heard about that somewhere when you were in junior high school. Didn't mean much to you, but as a musician, it should mean something to you. You know that A440 is an A that vibrates 440 times a second. All right? A220 would be an octave below that. A110 would be an octave below that. A55, an octave below that. A27.5. You can almost count them. All right? 27 and a half times a second. All right, so once you get below 20 cycles per second, it breaks down into individual events. All right? As you speed it up, it becomes a musical tone. That's the oscillation. So a low frequency oscillation is below the range that we recognize as a continuous sound. Now I'll give you another little example to help you picture this. If you were to take dots, take a pencil and put a dot on the page and then put a dot an inch apart, you could easily see the space between them. Well, now just get a little closer. All right, make the next one a little less than an inch. And keep the dots getting closer and closer and closer together, all right? Once at a certain point, your eye will not be able to see the dots anymore, it will just see a line. This is what your ear and brain do with sound. It won't be able to hear the individual events anymore, it becomes a blur. You can hear that is oscillating, all right? And the faster, that's oscillating twice as fast. So, a low frequency oscillator is responsible for rates, things that we go 1 or 2 times a second, all right? Maybe you have like a phase shifter that is moving like 5 times a second, all right? All right, that would be a rate, or once every 5 seconds. How's that? All right, so what we have is a low frequency oscillator. So pitch modulation. Now what's that? Pitch modulation depth. All right, as a musician, we have a word for that you're probably more familiar with. It's called vibrato, okay? Pitch modulation depth is changing the pitch higher and lower with an LFO, with a low frequency oscillation. So that's what we're going to be listening to here and get an idea of what that sounds like. Now let's take a look at one of the effects. So I'm going to touch the effect here and it gives me an overview of the effects. I'm on effect and routing. And what this shows me, left to right, is how the signal flows through the montage. Now, it's very important when you're dealing with any audio product to know where you are in the signal flow. When you have a problem, it's like following a pipe, all right? You want to find out where the leak is. So you follow the pipe from source to destination. So what this screen shows is the actual how the signal moves through the montage. So you're looking at the routing. Now, I mentioned that I am going to be dealing with the variation effect. So I'm going to touch the box that says variation. And now we're looking at the variation effect. This happens to be a dual modulator. It does both pitch and amplitude. All right, amplitude, of course, is loudness. So you'll see here that the LFO speed, I'm going to move the cursor down the highlight, LFO speed, which is 0.21 hertz. All right, so that's a rate. We wouldn't recognize that as a musical tone because it's way too low frequency. All right, remember we said 20 times a second. This is 0.21. So this is approximately once every 5 seconds, it's going to make some kind of change. All right. All right. So what I'm going to do is increase that so you can hear and see. That speed change. And as you can see, as I passed 20 times a second, it went all the way up to 39.7, you start to recognize it as a musical pitch. It's actually made a pitch of its own. All right, so it's very important. This is LFO speed, and it's one of the things that we're going to be controlling. So let's see that again. I'm going to go higher, and as soon as I get, all right, you can hear that. It almost sounds like that low pitch that I played, 27.5, all right? What you're hearing now is the change in the effect, all right, speeding up. It goes all the way up to 39.7. Now, you know, you may not want your phase shifter or your modulator to go that high, all right? So there's a depth control. Watch what happens when I lower the depth control. All right? So maybe there's somewhere in there a range that I would like, all right? Maybe from 0.21 hertz, all right, up to a certain amount, but then I don't want it to go into that self-oscillation. So I would need to control these two parameters simultaneously. Well, I'm playing the keyboard. How am I going to do that? With two knobs? All right. How am I going to do that with a control change message? What we have here now is parameter change. And what parameter change allows me to do is direct control to these two parameters simultaneously. So let's go back to 0.21 hertz. Of course, I could take it all the way down to 0, and the depth was about 80. And what is happening when I move the super knob, all right, and we'll take a look at this on the control screen, is the LFO speed, as it increases, so you can see here there's a graph of this increasing, and the ratio is positive, plus 22. But the depth is decreasing, all right? So as I turn the speed up, I'm turning the overall depth down so that it doesn't go into that self-oscillation thing. And it's really moving two parameters at once. This is the fundamental idea. So I can scale how much change happens. All right? I'm not limited to just making it more or less. I can turn the speed up and the depth down, which at the same time makes it very musical, because I decide how much modulation is going to happen. All right, so this is the basic idea. Now remember, we're on the upper level. So what I'm doing here now is simply using the super knob to directly control parameters within the effect. And this is a global effect. So that means every part that I use or every part I add to my program will be able to benefit by this, all right? So I'm controlling the system effect. That means everybody has a send to it. So if I have the drums sent to this effect, the LFO would affect the drums as well, all right? So very powerful, and the opening salvo of motion control.